Welcome to episode 11 of the Rabbi and the Shrink. And today we have our first ever guest superstar, Jennifer Elder. She is an accountant without a pocket protector and with a CSP, and she doesn't do taxes. What she does do is bring clarity to anyone in business to help them understand how to make a sustainable business. Her business is the Sustainable CFO. Welcome, Jennifer. Thanks for showing up.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to a great conversation around ethics and how that allows you to create a sustainable business.
All right, so let's talk about wherever you wanted to start. Your topic was pressures on ethics in times of crisis. Where do you want to kick this off, this conversation?
Well, I guess I'd like to start just by describing what I call the ethics diamond.
Ooh.
So what that is that there are four elements that come into play when there's an ethical challenge. So number one is you're presented with an ethical dilemma, which is when you have a choice to do or not to do something. And typically we call it a dilemma because no matter what you do, someone is likely to be hurt. If you're just making a decision, that's easy. The dilemma is when parties will be hurt no matter what you do. So the first part of the ethics diamond is there's a situation that arises and you have to choose what to do, knowing that someone will get hurt. Number two part of the diamond is that there are pressures on you. Now, the pressures could be from one side only, or they could be coming in from both sides. And sometimes we refer to that as the angel and devil on your shoulder that are both talking into your ears and pressuring you. The third element is rationalization. How can you justify your decision in one way or another? And those three elements are also the same elements in what's known as the fraud triangle. But with ethics, there's a fourth part, which is what's the likelihood of getting caught? These are all the things that come into play when we're faced with that ethical dilemma. Now, the pressures in a crisis, and there's absolutely no question that COVID-19 has been a crisis that never ends. There are more situations that are coming up where somebody could be hurt no matter what we do. We have people deciding whether to wear a mask or not. We have employers trying to decide, do we bring people back into the office or not? Do I get a vaccine or not? So there are these issues that are coming up. There are pressures from both sides and a lot of pressure. Now with COVID, unfortunately, many families were financially affected by COVID, that somebody was furloughed or laid off. And so there's financial pressure on people. The third element, rationalization. Well, there's a huge rationalization right now. It's not my fault. It's COVID. I didn't do this. I didn't ask to be in this situation. COVID put me there. And then the fourth element is the likelihood of getting caught. And now, if you're working from home, you're not in an office where people can hear you talking or see what you're doing for taking actions. You're now at home in your own little bubble. So if you think about the ethics, give you a real life example, driving a car, you're late for a meeting. Oh, here's the ethical situation. Do I speed or not? If I speed, I can get there on time. But if I speed, I could be hurting somebody. If I don't speed, I might be hurting myself. So we have pressures on both sides, to speed, to not speed. Rationalization. Well, I've never been in an accident speeding before, so I don't expect that I'll do it now. And the likelihood of getting caught. If you don't see a car with blue and red lights on top, you're going, I can get away with this. Until you see that car with blue and red lights, and all of a sudden, you put on the brakes and say, I better go back to being ethical. So the crisis just exacerbates all elements of this diamond. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. What do you think?
I always ask the rabbi first because I love this man's mind and his stories. Rabbi, what's your take on all this? The whole idea of, especially the angel and the devil. I don't know. Do you believe in the devil?
Oh, well, that's a theological discussion we'll save for another time. There's so many so many ways we could go, Jennifer, with these ideas. I honed in particularly on rationalization because I've identified the three enemies of ethics, and the first and most dangerous of those is rationalization. Because we talk about very often that when things are black and white, it's not that much of a challenge to us. But when we get into those gray areas where we have to balance who's going to get hurt, how much are they going to get hurt, we're trying to prioritize principles and consequences. And that's just fertile ground for rationalization, because we can come up with reasonable sounding explanations for either option.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it really comes down to a matter of personal integrity. How honest can I be with myself? And then the point you made about, will I get caught? It also shows us how much we need a community that's based in ethics to help us. Because if it's just me versus my devil, I'm at a real disadvantage. But if I've got
that's
a bunch
a little
of
bit of a
people on my side-
problem right now.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
we don't
that
have a
isolation.
community. Where so many people are feeling isolated, either because working from home or working in a location that has fewer people there, or just trying to stay in a COVID-free bubble. So
Yeah, and you hear people talk about Zoom fatigue. I'm so grateful that we have this, because at least we can create some kind of community. Can you imagine 20 years ago how isolated we would be if we were going through this right now?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely. And that's even how Jennifer and I met. We were at a meeting with Gina Carr doing this amazing thing. And this was at the very beginning. She was one of the first ones to do the Zoom stuff. And we got Zoom bombed by some nasty stuff. So we all closed out the meeting and started to go back to the Facebook group that she had, the Video Rock Stars. And I'm there, nobody's there. And I find Jennifer. So I said, well, come join me. So we did our own thing and we became dear friends. So it's funny how community now it's ironic in the midst of one of the worst ethical dilemmas you can have online. You have to close it down right away. And that's how we met. So it's interesting.
We have a comment in the chat about the cost, whether it's life and death, or did you just forget to return a pencil before you left the office? That to me is part of the rationalization. And having done fraud investigations, I have seen where somebody starts out by stealing $50 from petty cash. And the rationalization is, it's not thousands of dollars. I'm not costing anybody their job. It's just $50 and I'll put it back. And then they didn't get caught. And now they get a little bit bolder, just like we do in that car. You know, when you first learn to drive, most of us had our hands glued to the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and we're very careful about the speed limit. But then we learned that if you drive a little bit faster, there's no punishment for it. So we decide that resets what's acceptable. So driving 55 might be the speed limit, but 60 becomes acceptable. And then maybe that you find a friend who's talked to a police officer who has told them, we don't bother you unless you're more than 9 miles over the speed limit. And now you've reset what's acceptable. And that happens with these ethics situations, is that if there's no punishment right up front, people get bolder, and it starts that $50 turns into 100, which turns into 1,000. And even Bernie Madoff, quote unquote, said, well, you know how it is. It starts off with a couple hundred, then it's a couple thousand, and then, you know. And became $84 million. So we can say the cost doesn't matter, but it actually can. That to your point, Yonason, that that pencil may not be a big deal right now, but there's no community there to tell us that that's the wrong thing. And we are listening to our own angel and devil on our shoulder. And it's very easy for that devil to win when it's just you and there's no light of day on the situation.
So much of life is habit. And the habits that we form become sort of programming inside us. And so the sages teach that the first time a person transgresses, it's a transgression. And the second time he transgresses, it's permitted. And the third time he transgresses, it's a value. It's actually become a good deed because between the habit and the rationalization, and we end up in places that we never would have imagined we would ever go because we do it step by step. There's something I don't understand. Somebody maybe can explain it to me sometime. Is if logicians or social philosophers, they call it the fallacy of the slippery slope. The slippery slope's really not I don't get it, because this is exactly what we're talking about. You start small, you cross that line a little bit, and once you've crossed it, then there's no end to it. This particular example I like because my childhood hero was Harry Truman, and I remember that Harry Truman, before he left the Oval Office, he returned 2 pencils that he had borrowed, which weren't his, they were the country's. And it's so easy to say, come on, it's 5-10 cents, but that's where it starts.
Right. Now, I have read about the fallacy of the slippery slope. And part of what they talk about it being a fallacy is that ethics is not black and white. And our approach to ethics as individuals is not black and white. It's more like a rubber band, that it might stretch out and then come back, depending upon the pressures that you're under. So for example, we've read recently about people cutting the line on vaccines. Somebody could be a very ethical person, but if you're a caretaker for somebody who's at high risk and you can't get the vaccine, you might feel that pressure that I have a 96-year-old mother. She got the vaccine, but I'm her caretaker and I didn't. I don't want to. I would never forgive myself if I brought the vaccine to my family member. So, and then once they get the vaccine, they're going to go back to being ethical again. So it's kind of, how do you stop? How do you prevent people from really going off that slope?
So
and continuing to slide?
So let's talk about misbehavior. One of the things that all of us are helping organizations with is the culture of misbehavior. We have to make it somehow part of the dialogue on a daily basis. And some companies do it better than others. We have Carl Granger on here with Woods Construction, which is my avatar for good behavior. So like many companies, let's say someone does something, a mistake. Maybe they took a pencil, maybe they did something more grievous. It doesn't matter. If we create a culture where people can say, I made this huge mistake, or I made this little mistake, so that you can remedy it without being so strict and so nasty with repercussions, give people a chance to talk it out and problem solve. That's one of the areas where we can intervene on the slippery slope, because everyone's on a slippery slope. I mean, there's so many choices, and sometimes we just feel special and the rules don't apply to us. Like my mother, when people would double park, she said, ay, mijita, they're just special. We pobrecito, they're special. We have to allow them. And she was teasing, meaning they're so narcissistic that they think the rules don't belong to them. But so I think that with supervisors, owners, corporations, I think it's really critical that we find a way. How do you use mistakes and missteps as an opportunity to open a dialogue to create an ethical culture? especially in COVID times, it's almost like people feel like there's a do-over. So there's behaviors that are acceptable regular times, and now these are the COVID rules. Well, it's not quite true. The ethics are the same regardless of the times, but it feels different, right? Is it okay to do X, Y, and Z when you're in crisis? So I'm going to ask both of you, how do you help corporations create that culture of ethics where you can prevent it, intervene early, and fix problems, even if it's a little bit later? What do you suggest?
Yonason, I'll let you take the first stab at that.
Rabbi, it's all you.
Yeah, changing a culture is really, I mean, that's ultimately why we're doing this. We want to change the culture that we live in.
Yep.
There's a tremendous inertia that we're fighting against. So it feels like we're trying to hold back the tide. So ultimately, everything always starts with the individual. In the case of a business culture, the individual, where it really starts, is the person at the top.
Yep.
Because culture flows downhill. It's like water. And if there isn't a message of ethics, of standards that is modeled from the top down, then if you think of it like little kids, what's the most damaging thing to little kids is mixed messages. If parents say one thing and they do something else, because that just destroys a child's confidence in principle, in responsibility, in accountability, in honesty, integrity. And if you think about it, and this may not sound politically correct, but just go with the analogy. If you think of employees in a sense as the children, they're looking up to the leader. And if they see a leader who, to use the cliche, talks the talk and walks the walk, then they can be inspired. Look at this person setting standards and living up to them. I want to be part of this. I want to be like that. I want to be connected. But if they see hypocrisy, if they see double standards, you say, it's all a game. Nobody takes it seriously. And why should I?
And with smaller companies, it becomes more like family. So you've known people for forever, and someone does something pretty terrible. Maybe they, by mistake, show an image that is inappropriate, and they're in a leadership position. Normally, if we just met them, we'd fire them. But we've known them for 30 years. We're in that slippery slope. There's excuses and rationalizations. What do? Is there a way to fix it? Do you just have to fire them? So I think every company has questions. What is the best way to further the dialogue and enhance an ethical culture? How do we handle mistakes? I think is one of the hallmarks of an ethical culture. So they're going to happen. Jennifer, your wisdom, ma'am.
Well, I always tell people the number one way to promote ethics at your organization is to keep it on the front page. Too many organizations have their values and ethics, and I call them 3P. They print them out, they post them on the wall, and then they pray that people follow them. But they don't talk about them. And oftentimes when you look at organizations' values, that can be conflicting right in their value statements. So to your point, Rabbi, yes, people get these mixed messages. So we need to talk about ethics. We need to talk about it on a regular basis and provide people with examples. To your point, Margarita, is that when an ethical dilemma comes up in an organization, it shouldn't be buried. We should use it as a teaching moment. Let's talk about it. Let's see what happened. Let's explain why it happened. And also, the organization needs to kind of look at themselves too and say, how did we allow this to happen? Too often, if there is an ethical problem at an organization, they are quick to fire somebody. But if there's an ethical problem at an organization, it's going to happen again unless the organization takes some steps to prevent it in the future. Now, a couple of things I like to do to promote that would be, Rabbi, you mentioned tone at the top. I like to remind people that the top is your boss. So it's not just the CEO, it's anyone who has an employee. You're the top to that employee. You may have one part-time person, you're the top. You may have 7 layers above you, but you're still the top to that one person. So it's incumbent upon every person to talk about ethics on a regular basis. I used to, when I was CFO for companies, one of the things I liked to do was get them to paint a phrase, literally paint it in their boardroom. And that phrase was, is this the right thing to do? That's a different question than, is it legal? Or can we do it?
And is it affordable?
Yes. So I like to put that front and center to everyone's decision making, is when you get down to making a decision, finally ask that question. Is this the right thing to do? Puts it in a very different context.
That's why I like to say that ethics begins where compliance ends, because you can be in compliance and still be unethical. And if we want to let compliance do the ethical thinking for us, it's just not going to work. Right. I'd like to, Margarita, you mentioned how we deal with mistakes, and you put me in mind that there's a biblical verse that says, speaking to a shepherd, if an animal is attacked and killed by a wild animal, one of your livestock, your sheep, just take the meat, take the animal, and throw it to the dog. So what dog? Well, if you're a shepherd, you have a dog helping you tend the flock. Well, why did the animal get through and attack the sheep? Because the dog didn't do its job. So it sounds like you're rewarding the dog for failing in its duty. But what the verse is telling us is that if the dog is, for the most part, doing its job, none of us are perfect. The dog's not perfect. Don't punish the dog for the one time that it failed. Show the dog at the time of its failure that it still has your confidence and that you appreciate what it does for you. And of course, we're not primarily concerned with the feelings of the dog. It's a lesson for how to treat people. When someone stumbles, when someone makes a mistake, don't focus in on that mistake. Look at the larger picture. Is this a loyal collaborator, loyal partner, loyal employee? Is this a person who generally gets the job done? Take the moment of failure and focus on the successes.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of dog, when a company has a problem with misbehavior of any kind, or even just they want to function even better, most companies wait till there's a problem, but some actually call me before there's a problem. That's a concept. I call it dog ethics. Most companies it's like scolding the dog. They only bring up ethics when they're scolding the dog. And other than that, they never mention it. So it's funny that you brought up the idea of dogs. So from Aya, we have a question. What is the role and relationship of ethics with sustainability? Is it possible to survive without ethics? Good question. Who wants to hit that one first? Rabbi?
This is actually something that I'm incorporating into a program I'm designing.
I know, which is why I asked you first.
Yeah, well, it's the biblical stories don't have to really be seen as particularly theological. I like to look at them as profiles in ethical courage. And the story of Noah, what was going on in that generation? Scripture says that the world was filled with violence. And how did that happen? It happened because people became obsessed with themselves. They began seeing other people as assets or opportunities. And eventually there was so much violence in the world that the world was going to self-destruct. People were going to kill themselves off. And so Noah has this responsibility to save the world. And there are two ways he can save it. He can save it by convincing people to change their ways. And it took him 120 years to build the ark. And so people come by, what are you building? Building an ark. Why? Because the world's going to be destroyed, because we're not getting along with each other. They had the opportunity to listen or not listen. And the second way that he could save the world is by not letting, if he couldn't bring them up to a level where they recognize their own humanity, he could resist the downward pull, not let them change him, which ultimately is what happens and why he gets saved. And because he gets saved, mankind gets saved. It's that responsibility to, on the one hand, we want to try to change and improve the culture we're in. And at the same time, we want to resist letting that culture change us in negative ways.
Mhm.
So if we look at sustainability and the question of can we survive without ethics, I think about Beyond the Thunderdome. I don't know if we have movie buffs out there. Even in the Thunderdome, which is a post-apocalyptic kind of nightmare, there were ethics within each group. Every group has ethics, whether we agree with them or not. What is their standard? What is their expectation? We've talked about Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. They have a culture of ethics with a strict ethical set of guidelines, and they can get ousted or killed if they go against them. So, Jennifer, you are the sustainable CFO. Surely this question is right up your alley.
It certainly is. And to your point, Margarita, every person and every organization has a set of values and ethics. The question is, does it fit the moral climate of the time? And does the ethics of the organization resonate with their customers? Because the reality is we do business with people that we know, like, and trust. Trust is the key there. Because if there's been an ethical failure that your employees, your customers see as an ethical failure, they don't trust you anymore. And for publicly held companies that have an ethics issue that hits the news, their stock price will drop 29% on average within 3 days.
Good.
Has a huge effect on organizations. And the problem is, once burned, twice shy. So it takes a much longer time to regain people's trust. So I would argue that no, you can't have a sustainable organization without some ethics that resonate with your customers. But is there one set of ethics? I'm not sure there's an answer to that. Depends on the culture that you're in, what part of the world you're in. There are different ways of doing business. So it's a matter of deciding what are your ethics, how are you going to live up to it, and how are you going to share that with your customers and your community.
And in time of COVID, that's one of the things people have been struggling with. What are the new set of ethics that we have to deal with in business or personal life or in the community that adapt to the new world created by COVID? And I know that we will never go back to exactly where we were. And I don't like the phrase new normal. Let's have a new better. What will the new better look like? And what are we going to keep? And I think that ethics and values are so intertwined, they will always be changing. One of the things I do is help people write their manuals, their ethic manuals, their principles, their guidelines. It's hard to do. And having a team brainstorm, many companies have never fought about those issues. Rabbi, you were talking about all the rabbis arguing and how that's part of the culture. And many people do not have a sharing of ideas without shouting. And I think that's an important thing for us to learn to do in any organization if we're going to be sustainable.
Yeah,
also,
one of the real challenges.
Oh, go ahead, Rabbi.
Just one of the real challenges that goes beyond business, or is really an extension of business, is that our whole culture has become one of being confrontational and being ideological. And you talked, Jennifer, about is it possible to have a single standard of ethics? Well, we have to have certain core values that we believe in, because if we don't, how can we possibly function together? And yet at the same time, as we become more and more ideologically polarized, it's very difficult to find points to agree on. And so this is why I think the business conversation is so important, because the one thing we can agree on is we want to make more money.
That's always nice.
Yeah, and if you can recognize that good ethics is good business, and that having a culture with a foundation of core values will be a successful enterprise, if we can create more of that in business, then maybe it'll spill out into the wider community instead of
And the
letting
problem is that good ethics are sometimes more expensive in the short run.
in the short run. Yeah.
In
Yeah.
the short run. In the long run, they are exceptionally profitable. Harvard has done a number of studies, including one with University of London, where they found that companies with strong ethics had 4 times the sales of similar companies in their industry whose ethics were weaker.
Well,
Their
because
profits
business is
were 2
trust.
times higher.
Yeah, business is trust. Now, from Richard Messing, we always get interesting questions, and he put it in the Q&A, so you can put things in the chat or the Q&A. Is it not our responsibility to help others raise their ethical standards in business and in life in general by teaching ethical principles to as many people as we can bring into our sphere of influence? That's a typical Richard question, and I love it. Who's going to attack that one first?
Well,
Right,
I would say that's a tough one, in that everybody has their own personal set of values. And I think it becomes a problem when we try and impose our values on somebody else. And you talked about people, getting into arguments and ideological, fortitude. We have to be able to discuss and debate. Debate is a skill that we have lost. We seem to jump from a discussion to an argument, and it has to get nasty. One of the phrases my dad gave me early on, and it has come to help me so often, is when I don't see eye to eye with somebody, instead of saying, I don't get it, or I don't agree, which can escalate into an argument, I will ask the question this way: help me understand. And in effect, I'm de-escalating the issue, because I'm not saying this is your problem. I'm saying it's my problem. I don't get it. Help me understand your position. And an interesting thing is our brain is hardwired to respond to the word help. So all of a sudden, I want to reach out and help you. And you've just asked me to explain. So now I have to use different words. And often I find that when somebody starts trying to explain, not just repeat what they said, they may actually see the flaw in their argument, or I'm enlightened and I see their point. So that's a phrase I like to break out, is help me understand, particularly if I'm not seeing eye to eye with somebody, and in particular with an ethical issue. To say, help me understand. And that's a way of teaching and listening at the same time.
So there's the key thing, listening. One of the hard parts of these debates that aren't really debates but arguments is, I think listening is also a lost art. Listening to understand, listening with curiosity. I think curiosity and trust go hand in hand. If a leader has enough curiosity, if a listener has enough curiosity, they can listen to something that they would die opposing. And I think learning to be curious goes to your dad. What was your dad's name?
Brian Howard.
All right. So Brian Howard, thank you for that, Jim. And we'll remember you, Brian, forever. So help me understand. And I think that's a great way. Now, we have, can you discuss whistleblowing in organizations?
Whistleblowing that's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
The reason whistleblowing came about was in some organizations, Yonason, to your point about compliance, some organizations may be focused entirely on compliance, but maybe at the expense of ethics. What is lawful may be awful. And so when an organization wasn't listening, that's when we came up with the idea of having a whistleblower. So for publicly held organizations, the SEC has a whistleblower program. And that a lot of that came out from the late 1980s and some serious ethical violations by large publicly held companies. The interesting thing about whistleblowing is it's also, another word for it would be tattletale. And that can be hard for people. You know, we're taught since we were little kids not to tattletale. And then suddenly as an adult, you're asking people to tattletale. I would prefer an organization have an internal way of listening to people's concerns and making sure that everybody in your organization understands what that process is. So as a CFO, every once in a while, I would ask my staff, if you thought I was doing something wrong, who would you go to? Because they have to go over my head.
Yes.
And I want them to know that it's okay. Please do that. If you think I'm doing something wrong, I'm not perfect. We all have blind spots. We all make mistakes. So I want to know that people know who to talk to. And if they're not comfortable with it, having a hotline that people can use, either a hotline where somebody makes a phone call, or a hotline could be an email while people report things.
Or a third party. Sometimes people use me as a hotline and you as a hotline.
Mm-hmm.
And they're given permission to talk to me about ethical dilemmas. And then I report it as one voice without anyone fearing reprisals, right?
Yep.
I love that, Jennifer, that your message of hold me accountable or help me hold myself accountable.
Yes.
Because again, it goes back to that idea of community. If I don't feel I'm being held accountable, then it's already a tougher fight because I'm not aware or I'm not sensitive to the consequences of my actions, which makes it a whole lot easier to rationalize and to cut corners and to do things that otherwise I wouldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes
the
to
military academy has their motto. I think it's the Air Force Academy, which says, "Thou shalt not lie, cheat, nor steal." The second part is, "nor tolerate anyone who does." That's the harder part, is when we have to hold other people accountable. So we need to make a safe space in our organizations where we can hold other people accountable, or at least be able to ask the question. Because sometimes you may see something that looks horrible, but it may not be. Give you an example. I had one of my employees who worked second shift called me at home at 10 o'clock at night. She was shaking. I could hear it in her voice. She's like, "Jen, I don't want to bother you at home." "It's okay. Wendy, tell me what was happening." She said, "It was David. David just stole a whole box of laptops. I saw him walk out with laptops to his car, 2 boxes worth." I was like, "Okay, thank you so much for calling me." And she's like, "Are you sure I did the right thing?" "Absolutely. You did the right thing. Let me find out. I'll take a look into it tomorrow and I'll get back to you." Now, it sounds horrible. And it does sound like David was stealing, except what she doesn't know was that David called me at 8:30 at night and said, "I have to update all these laptops. And everybody keeps interrupting me and I can't get it done." He said, "Can I take them home? And I'll bring them back tomorrow." And I said, "Sure. Go right ahead. Tell me how many you're taking, how many are coming back." So I knew what was going on. But I didn't want to tell Wendy right then and there that I knew what was going on, because if I did, she would never talk to me about something again. It would have come across as though she was wasting my time. I wanted her to know that she could call me with anything at any time. So the next day, I stayed for second shift and talked to her and said, "Thank you so much for coming to me. I really appreciate it. I looked into it. David was updating the laptops, and I didn't tell her that he had called me. So there's an error of omission. So we could argue the ethics of that. I didn't give her the whole story because I wanted to make sure that she would still think that she did the right thing by telling me. So we need to support people. When somebody is whistleblowing, you need to support them because they feel like all eyes will be on them.
So one pet peeve I have is that people think that putting something in social media is whistleblowing. I think that's a cowardly act. I think you have to, many people are very quick to look like the good guy by titling on the bad guy. That's just cowardice. I think that if there is a real issue, you take constructive action, calling the CEO, talking to your immediate boss, doing whatever. If it is your immediate boss, go over her, go to the next person. And I think that one of the problems in many of these ethical cultures and organizations, people really don't know what to do. So who to talk to, how, when, how to listen. I think we have to teach people how to do that. And so I just proposed that sometime in the near future, we're going to create an ethics summit. And part of it will be teach people, we're going to have some case scenarios and teach people exactly how to think about it, how to act, how to make it happen, how to put it together, all of that. All right, so now we have a question. Like anything you want to sell, why can't we sell the value of ethics so that we can enroll people into educational programs where they can increase their ethical knowledge? All right, what say you?
Well, one of the most, I think, insidious phrases that we have is soft skills.
Yes.
Why? Because it sounds like it's something you get to after you've done the important stuff. And this is why the language that we use is also a matter of ethics. I mean, my TED Talk is called Ethical Communication. And what you were explaining, Jennifer, is it's not enough to know what I believe. It's not even enough to be right. I have to be able to articulate my ideas in a way that other people can hear them and have a chance to understand them. And if we believe that these are soft skills and therefore they're not priorities, then we're just not going to give them the attention that they need. The best salesperson is someone who is so passionate about the product that enthusiasm just infects the person. My mother quit her job when she married my father. She didn't work until I'd gone off to college. And then she started selling timeshare. Now, my mother believed that timeshare was the greatest invention in modern history. Sincerely. And she felt she was doing people a favor by convincing them to invest in a timeshare. And she became the second most successful salesperson where she worked with no sales experience whatsoever, working half-time, because people just felt her sincerity and her authenticity. So you can argue about what your feelings about timeshare are, but the more passionate we are and the more articulate we are about the importance of ethics, the more we can transmit ethics as a value to the people that we interact with.
And that's why we need to keep talking about ethics at our organizations. Now, one of the things I love about my first profession as a certified public accountant is that we do have an ethics requirement that every 2 years, some states it's every year, but some states it's every other year. But when you renew your license, you will have had to have gotten some ethics training. Now, I have conducted ethics training at some organizations, and I have a problem with that sometimes, because sometimes I'm only brought in to talk to their certified public accountants on staff. And that's sending a message to everybody else that works in the organization that ethics is only important if you have a license. And I try and argue with people that don't just offer the ethics class to people who have to get an ethics course, make it mandatory for every employee. Demonstrate that you believe that it's that important, that everyone in the organization be trained on it on a regular basis. So I think we can sell the value of ethics.
I think we can too. So we've got 15 minutes left. So what I wanted to propose is that we do the word of the day, and then let's open up for more Q&A. And if you want to put in the chat, if you want me to unmute, just put in unmute and I'll unmute you. All right, Rabbi Sir, dun, 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 dun. Word of the day.
Word of the day comes from one of my favorite sources. Again, it's Susan Rooks, the grammar goddess. You can find her on LinkedIn with all sorts of interesting words you never heard before. And the one I saw from her is meliorism. Meliorism, which means the belief that it's possible to make the world better through human effort. And I thought, what a perfect word for an ethics discussion.
Well, I think we're all melioristic, if that's
right. Because if we weren't, if you don't believe that good behavior is going to make a difference, then why bother? Why do I need to be the chump who's trying to do the right thing, be one of those nice guys who finishes last? We really have to believe that we can influence the people around us for the better.
I think all of us.
Well, I might suggest that we won't be ethical unless we do believe that.
Excellent.
Because the other element to an ethical dilemma is pain. And often to do the right thing, it hurts us in some way, shape, or form. So I think we'd have to believe we're making the world a better place in order to inflict that pain on ourselves.
Yeah, because we can all deal with pain. What we can't deal with is pointless pain.
Exactly.
Especially if it's repeated and then not listened to by a group, whether it's a family or a team or an organization or a country or whatever, setting the tone for ethics. It's interesting. So
I think with an organization,
yes,
that to the rabbi's point, that we can deal with pain, but pain has to have a purpose. It has to have a point. So in organizations, I think it's very important that we help all of our employees understand the purpose of the organization. Connect the individual to the ethics of the organization. Everybody joins an organization with their own personal ethics. And given the choice between doing the right thing according to the business or doing the right thing according to us, we'll go with what's right for us. So we need to.
The elephant in the room there is that unfortunately there's two elements in human nature that get in the way. One is if someone else is in charge, we think, okay, I'm not my turn. The other thing is many people have forgotten to understand that they are important, that what they say and don't say matters, what they do and don't do matters, and how they do it. So how can we in families and in organizations, this is one of the questions, help everyone understand that not only are they important, but they are essential to changing the world with an ethical culture. So how can we do that? How do we make it easier for everyone to know that they matter?
I like to do an exercise and recommend that everybody do this exercise with their team, which is number one, ask, what are the ethics of our organization? Now, I've asked that in a training session when I know that the ethics of the organization are the screensaver to everybody's computer. So I know in the room with everybody with their laptops open, they can be looking at the ethics, and yet I tell them, close their eyes, tell me what the ethics are. And then people will randomly get 1, 2, or 3. They won't get all of them. So ask your staff, what are the ethics of the organization? Second question, how do you know that those are the ethics of the organization? What have you seen for behavior that demonstrates those ethics? And then number three, to your point, Margarita, the third part is, how do you as an individual support those ethics? And I like to have that conversation so people start to think about it and realize that it is their responsibility. It's not just, well, if it was a problem, somebody would tell me, or my boss made the decision, I'm going to abdicate to them. But you've got to let people think and figure it out on their own, that they can have an impact on their organization. It may be little things, but those little things add up to a huge ethical climate.
And the problem I see is when we have a superstar that is doing a bunch of everything. How does that superstar empower everyone else? And sometimes it's just easier, oh, I'll just do it. And so then pretty soon we have just one person carrying the whole load. And that person eventually will lose not only their health, but any viability for a sustainable anything, right? So how do we encourage ourselves and others to know that we matter? So
when
you guys have an idea, put it in the chat, please, or let me know you want to speak. Sorry, Rabbi, to interrupt.
That's okay. We talk about different parenting styles. So you've got the helicopter parent who hovers and makes sure that everything's okay, and you've got the drill sergeant who issues orders, and now they talk about the snow plow or the bulldozer parent who wants to eliminate all the problems. But the ideal parenting model is a consultant, that you talk things out with your kids, and this can apply to any kind of relationships, to be able to discuss what are our values. Do people feel free to come and ask advice? Or am I going to be seen as incapable of handling a problem on my own? Encourage members of a team to consult with one another. I mean, something I do when I write an article or column that's a little bit, let's say, potentially scandalous or controversial. Sometimes I'll send it off to a couple of people, and often people who don't see things just the way I do. To how does this sound? How is this coming across? Because I don't need to get everything perfect by myself. I want to make things as good as they can be. And sometimes that means that I collaborate and I cooperate and I bring other people into the decision-making process. And if you cultivate a culture like that, I mean, this famous story about, what was it, Pixar, that they wanted the people in the different departments to talk to each other. So they put the restrooms in the center of the complex. And so people, when coming and going from the restrooms, they bump into people from other departments. And there's stories about these wonderful ideas that were generated because people who never would have come into contact with each other did, because they created a way of making it happen.
Yeah. Another way of thinking about ethics is that it is problem solving. And sadly, we've stopped teaching problem solving and decision making in schools. So sometimes somebody are faced with a problem, they will Google it or go on YouTube and see if they can find an answer there. And if it's not there, throw up their hands and go, I don't know. To your point, Margarita, if somebody comes to you and says, what should I do? You can end up bearing all of the weight if you keep telling people what the answer is. You become the answer man. I do not want that role. I have enough work to do on my own. I don't need to be the one, go ask Jen. She'll tell you. So I like to ask the people, somebody comes to me and says, I don't know what to do next. So I will try and teach problem solving while we're at it. Say, what have you tried? What do you think we should do next? And again, to your point, Rabbi, we think alike here, is who could you ask for help? And I want them to be able to go through those 3 steps before they come to me, so that they learn to try and solve the problem on their own. And now if they're still struggling, then we can problem solve together and say, well, okay, what have you tried? Okay, you've tried this, this, and this. What do you think we should do next? What are your options? Let's talk those through. Who else did you talk to? Great. What was their input? Now let's brainstorm and talk it through. And the more you get people comfortable with their being willing to ask questions and knowing that you're not going to go, just give it to me, and sound annoyed, then they learn, and we elevate our staff. And the more we can elevate them, the more we elevate ourselves.
I agree. So Richard did something smart. He used his Zoom hand to raise his hand, so I unmuted him. Richard, sir, your comment or question?
Yeah, the question was asked, how do we encourage people to be ethical? I think the answer to that question, the answer is in the question. It requires courage to be ethical. It requires courage. We have to teach people that it requires courage. And courage is related to fear. And we have to acknowledge that sometimes it's fearful to, be ethical. It's, people could, disagree, or, there could be consequences. So an organization needs to acknowledge this to their employees, that it takes courage, that it could be scary. And the organization, I suggest, should have incentives, should have a reward system to reward people for making ethical decisions, if they're doing the difficult ethical thing. And if an organization taught, like, Jennifer, like you're saying, if organizations talk about ethics proactively and talk about these principles and acknowledge that it can be scary, acknowledge that it takes courage, that we as an organization will back you and will reward you for being ethical, for doing the difficult ethical thing, then I think then we'll have a structure in an organization that will be really promoting, creating a structure for promoting and bringing forth ethical behavior in a way that wouldn't happen otherwise.
I think that's a great idea, Richard. And then we're away from the dog ethics, where anytime anyone brings anything up, they get put in the kennel or punished somehow, right?
Right.
Furthering a conversation one ethical dilemma at a time and one mistake at a time. It's the only way to do it. We have to.
Interestingly, when there was a study done about offering a reward for people who called into an ethics hotline, and they found that the number of calls did not increase. The people who have the courage may not be looking for a monetary reward. My personal experience is the reward they're looking for is to be told they did the right thing, the support. And some of them want to remain in the background. They don't want, let me share this story and you're the hero. No, I don't want that. Some are fine with that. So I think it's important when you're thinking about rewards for people is think about the individual and what would they want as a reward. So the support, whatever that may be, some people may want a $50 gift card. Others just want the pat on the back.
Against physical rewards of any kind, because I think that it undermines ethics. We do things because it feels good, because we get an atta girl or atta boy or atta non-binary, whatever we call it. So the whole idea of reward should be more intrinsic. And I think that it's kind of like, let's say we're teaching a child how to save money, and they're almost to the point where they can buy the thing they've been saving for. And then say, okay, we'll give you the rest. We have just undermined their value, the ethic that they've created on self-discipline, saving, planning, whatever. So I think that some of these reward programs, I think they undermine the value. And then you have maybe false calls, people who are exaggerating or even lying. Oh, good. We have another chat here. Let me see what it is.
Well, the one reward that I used that went over very well was, this happened twice. I used the same reward, 2 different organizations. But somebody came forward. It took a lot of courage to do it in both cases. And it was exceptionally stressful for them. So when the situation was resolved, my quote unquote reward to them was a day off.
Yes.
And said, you were been very stressed for the last couple of weeks over this. You need a day to do nothing. So thank you for stepping forward. Here, have the day off, and you should have seen the smiles and the glowing, and they just felt good about that.
That is a good thing.
The funny thing is, they shared that story. This was one of them was someone who didn't want any limelight whatsoever. But people asked, why'd you take the day off? Oh, I was given an extra day off because I did the right thing. That's a story I want spread throughout the organization.
And I agree, because it takes a lot of time when someone doesn't do the right thing. So it makes sense in terms of time use. So Aya has one final comment. It is time for us to close. To encourage the people, it's good to be careful with the word reward against the value of ethics. And I think that that's a great thing. So Rabbi and Jennifer, do you have one last final thing to say?
I'd like to just round off this idea that Stephen Carter in his book Integrity talks quite a bit about whistleblowing. And he says it should be hard because you don't want people using whistleblowing as a weapon or making frivolous aspersions on people. It should be difficult. But to Jennifer's point, that if we do when you do something that's difficult and you have a feeling at the end that it was worth it, that is its own reward. And that's what an ethical culture creates, because it's not the $50 certificate. It's not even the day off per se. It's the feeling that I did the right thing and it was worth it.
I don't think I can top that.
I know.
That really is the benefit. I think that offsets the fear. There is the fear of all the things that can go wrong. And fear is an acronym. It stands for false expectations appearing real. So we work up into a frenzy of all these bad things that are going to happen. And yes, it can be difficult. But that wonderful feeling of knowing that you've done the right thing far outweighs that fear anytime. And organizations need to celebrate when somebody has done the right thing. We are too quick to let people know when somebody got fired. But how about we share the stories of when somebody did the right thing? We don't have to name names, but you can share the scenario. And that's a celebration in and of itself.
So I'm going to close by thanking you, Jennifer, the sustainablecfo.com. She's amazing. Check her out. Thank you all for showing up and sharing your ideas. We feel your prayers and your positive energy. And I'm going to leave with the final words. Remember that you matter. Words matter and ethics matter. We'll see you next week. Please spread the word. We'd like to be able to change the world together. And thank you for helping making that possible. See you next week.